Good evening and welcome to the Reflections on Memorial Day program. I'm Dave Kaiser from Channel 12, honored to be part of the program tonight. How about another hand for the Cooper Woodwind Quintet that joined us tonight? We have a number of items planned for you this evening. First off, I would like to mention the flags. How many noticed the flags as you drove up this evening, drove around the construction to where we are tonight? I'll just mention that there are over 600 flags lining Golden Valley Road for about 1.5 miles in length from Highway 100 to Winnetka Avenue. So if you have time in the next few days, walk down that street, pay tribute to the fallen, and 83,299 still unaccounted for POW MIAs. Flag Row will be available for viewing beginning on May 19th, which it already is, obviously, through May 26th. So a great way to honor those who have served down the street. Now, we have a full program tonight. We have many people that will be speaking to you here, but we have one guest that could not make it. That via video, we have the guest. U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar wanted to send a greeting to you. So I'm going to step forward and touch the video here, and please listen in.
Hello to all my friends taking part in the Golden Valley Memorial Day celebration today. I think you know I would much rather be there with you in person, but there's just a few things going on right now, so I'm honored to join you via video. I want to begin by thanking everyone that's there, including Master of Ceremonies Dave Kaiser, Colonel Loren Hubert of the Minnesota National Guard. Do we not have the best guard in the country? We do. Also the veterans, families, and friends. No matter what service you belong to, and no matter what conflict you fought in, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam, to the hills of Korea, to the mountains of Afghanistan, to the sands of Iraq, members of America's military have all made tremendous sacrifices to keep our nation strong and free. We are all deeply indebted to you. Every year on Memorial Day, we honor the fallen heroes, the sons and daughters, the husbands and wives, the friends and neighbors who courageously gave their lives so that we may continue to live free. We mourn these fallen heroes and stand with their families in their grief. And we also continue to honor those lost during earlier wars. In Golden Valley, you remember Private Chester Piatzig, known as Chester Bird, who was inducted into your city's Hall of Fame just last year. Chester was part of the first wave of soldiers on Omaha Beach, and he later was reported as killed in action during fierce fighting in France. It's believed that he was laid to rest there after giving his own life defending the lives and freedom of others. We also honor all the men and women who have worn a uniform in our armed forces and made it home safely. In Minnesota, we never forget to pay our respect to our vets. Our state has a proud tradition of service to our country. As your senator, I'm committed to ensuring that our nation honors the debt we owe our veterans and that our government fulfills its obligation to all of our veterans, whether they completed their service last week, last year, or decades ago. Veterans have done so much for us. It's only right that we do right by them. This is our solemn promise to veterans. When you are sent overseas, you will have the resources you need to carry out your mission. When you are away, your families will be cared for as if they were our own family. And when you return from duty, we greet you with the homecoming you deserve. When our troops signed up to serve and defend our country, there was no waiting line. And when they return home, there shouldn't be a waiting line in our country. Not for education, not for a job, and certainly not for health care. In the Senate, I've worked hard to ensure better and safer equipment for our troops, improved health services for veterans, and a stronger support network for families and service members throughout the deployment cycle. That's why Congressman John Klein and I introduced legislation to ensure that the benefits would not be lost for our National Guard when they actually cut their benefits while they were overseas. That was just wrong. We were successful. We were able to pass that bill, and we wouldn't have done it without the bipartisan support of all of Minnesota's delegation. That's just an example of what we do in our state. We stand up for our veterans, and I believe we need to be vigilant and do it every single day. But today, as you know, is a day of mourning. It's a day of looking back, keeping promises to those that are still with us, but also keeping promises to the families of those that we have lost. You've protected America's greatness and kept us safe and strong, and we are eternally grateful. When it comes to honoring our troops, our country must be as good as its promise, whether that means getting veterans what they need, or whether that means treating those we have lost with dignity and respect. Not many things in this world are lasting, but the people who fought and died for our country, they have left an enduring mark, a living legacy that continues in the freedoms we cherish and the values we stand for. We remember our soldiers today by honoring them, by saluting them, and by keeping our promises to them.
And thank you to Senator Klobuchar for the message. Now we're to the point with our first main speaker of the evening, and we have the honor of hearing from Colonel Loren M. Hubert. He is the Vice Chief of Staff and Director of Staff Air for the Joint Forces Headquarters, Minnesota National Guard. In this capacity, he serves as the primary full-time representative and spokesperson for the Minnesota Air National Guard on the Adjutant General's Joint Army Air Staff. A little background about him. He was born in Duluth, so not too far away from us here. Earned his bachelor's degree from the College of St. Thomas. Joined the Minnesota Air National Guard in November of 1991 and has proudly served and continues to serve our country since that time. Now, you are in for a treat tonight because the title is From the Militia to the National Guard, 377 years in defense of our nation. And we had a chance to talk a little bit ahead of time. And this man is a history buff and knows a lot about what has happened in the past. And obviously, he is one that people look to share this message. So join me in welcoming Colonel Hubert.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks to Master Sergeant John Giese for setting this up, for the great flags you and your crew put out there, and to all. I know there's some veterans in the chambers here tonight as well. So waiting here for the slides to come up. I think also thanks to our city council, or our city manager, Tom Burt, for helping out tonight and keeping the chambers open for us. Hoping they'll come up. They were up earlier.
They are flipping the switch as we speak.
Okay. I'll stand by and be patient. There we go. Well, very good. Is this mic, can you hear it? Is it working, or? It is working. I'll get it a little closer here. There we go. Well, I was going to start out with a Memorial Day message, but I think Senator Klobuchar said it all. I would just ask all of you to take an opportunity, if you have a relative or if you're aware of somebody who sacrificed for this country at some point, try to give them a moment of remembrance, or even visit a grave if you have the opportunity this week or on Memorial Day itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a National Guardsman. I'm a member of the militia. While I wear the uniform of the United States Air Force, I'm not a member of the active duty military, at least not currently. This evening, I will tell you a story about the National Guard, what makes us unique, and what makes us critical to our communities, our state, and our nation. In the 1630s, a mere 10 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, the new colonies around Massachusetts Bay were growing rapidly, and the inhabitants of those colonies were becoming acutely concerned about increasing threats from outside their settlements. Therefore, on December 13th, 1636, the Massachusetts General Court in Salem decreed that all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 would be required to join the militia. These men were mostly farmers, but there were also blacksmiths, shopkeepers, carpenters, and various other trades and professions among them. It was understood that on very short notice they were to drop the tools of their trade and pick up their arms to defend their families and their colonies if needed. These citizen soldiers, as they became known at one point, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony would also muster, which means to gather, for military training when they were able, and they would be called upon to fight when needed. This was the birth of the National Guard 377 years ago. By comparison, the Army, Navy, and Marines are almost 140 years younger than the National Guard. And the Air Force, a mere infant at over 300 years younger than the National Guard. By 1645, it became apparent that at times the militias were not able to respond rapidly enough if there was an attack on their settlements. So they designated a group of men for rapid response, literally within minutes, and these became known as the Minutemen. Now, this statue of the Minuteman has become our symbol. And I like to tell the story of the Minuteman. If you look at him, you'll see that he has his powder horn draped over his back. He's got his militia coat on. He's got his rifle or musket in his hand. Significant to this also, probably mostly, is the fact that behind him is his plow. His field jacket that he wore when he'd plow the fields is draped over his plow, and he's leaving it behind. One hand on it, one hand on the musket as he steps away from his plow to take up arms to defend his people, his family, his country. This is the symbol of the National Guard. This is the symbol of the militia, and we proudly display it. The symbol of the Minuteman, as you can see, can be found in many, many places. And I'm sure you've probably seen it yourself in numerous places. Over the next 130 years, these Minutemen and the militias defended the 13 growing colonies of the future United States. By 1775, however, the British government was attempting to take these new colonies under their control for the British king, and you can bet many of the colonialists did not like it. So on the evening of April 18th, and you've all heard about it, 1775, a man named Paul Revere made his famous ride to warn the Minutemen. By the early hours of April 19th, armed militias were ready. Paul Revere was a Minuteman. He was a militiaman. Now, in the early hours of that morning of April 19th, Captain John Parker, one of the Minutemen, had mustered his militia on Lexington Green, just east of the city of Boston. He had heard that several British soldiers were approaching, and his militiamen were ready to confront them. Captain Parker's company of militia was typical of the period. They were mostly farmers. The youngest was 18 years old. The oldest was 63 years old. Many had fought in the French and Indian War, and among them were 8 pairs of fathers and sons. Just after sunrise, Parker and his militiamen saw the British approaching. Parker ordered his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they want to have a war, then let it begin here." The commander of the British advance guard showed up with 700 men. Parker had 77. He ordered Parker, shouted to him to drop their arms. Parker, wisely outnumbered 10 to 1, directed his men to disperse, figuring they would have another opportunity. Unfortunately, right then, the British opened fire on Parker and his men. So Parker and his men fired back, and there were several casualties on both sides that day. Now, the British continued on toward Concord, the next town up the road. And there another group of militia had mustered, and they were gathered on a hill overlooking the Concord Bridge in Concord, Massachusetts. About 500 yards away from the bridge in Concord, and as the same British regiment approached them, what they ended up doing was they came down the hill to confront the British who were trying to tear up the bridge. The British fired upon them, and Major John Buttrick shouted to his men, "Fire, for God's sake, fire!" And his men unloosed a ragged but heavy volley against the British soldiers and inflicted quite a few casualties on the British soldiers at that point. The British actually retreated, and Major John Buttrick's people went after them across the bridge. The British soldiers of that regiment were working their way back to Boston. In the meantime, many other militiamen who had been alerted, and Minutemen had been alerted by Paul Revere's ride earlier or later that evening prior, were gathered along the same road that the British were retreating back to Boston on, and they continued to engage the British all the way back. By the time the British made it back to Boston, they had 300 casualties inflicted by the Minutemen and the militias. Within a couple of days, over 20,000 militiamen had mustered, and they effectively surrounded the city of Boston and laid siege to it. Now, during the Revolutionary War, a standing military was established. Today we might call it the active duty. They were established to fight the British. They were known as the regulars. They were funded, trained, and equipped by the government of the fledgling 13 United States. And they were led by General George Washington. The state militias banded together to fight battles when they were able, but they were still composed of citizen soldiers with their own private muskets, their own equipment, their own personal gear. And they lacked much of the training and equipment possessed by the regulars. Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot, while not terribly accurate historically, does a pretty good depiction, however, of the difference between the regulars and the militias. After victory over the British in the Revolutionary War, the militias returned to their farms, their jobs, their families, while the regulars, today we call them the active duty, generally disbanded, at least mostly, but this was by design. George Washington himself wanted nothing more than to return to his farm and farm it. He said, "Although a large standing army in time of peace hath ever been considered dangerous to the liberties of a country, yet a few troops, under certain circumstances, are not only safe, but indispensably necessary. Fortunately for us, our relative situation requires but few." Clearly, our founders, along with George Washington, believed that a standing military was not, that only a small standing military was necessary in peacetime. As the 19th century progressed, the standing military continued to expand and contract depending on the wars that they were engaged in. Meanwhile, the militias continued to contribute to the defense of our young nation in virtually every conflict. In the Battle of North Point, we defended the city of Baltimore and effectively brought an end to the War of 1812. By the mid-1820s, militias were starting to be called the National Guard after a visit by the Marquis de Lafayette to the New York militia, and with him were his soldiers called La Garde Nationale. By the Civil War, the militias, or the National Guard of the northern states, were signing up to fight for the Union Army. Only 3 years into statehood, the first governor to offer troops to Abraham Lincoln to fight for the Union Army was Alexander Ramsey, the governor of Minnesota. The Minnesota Militia Volunteers trained at Fort Snelling right here in St. Paul. And the 1st Minnesota Regiment, as it became known, fought at the battles of Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. It was, however, during the Battle of Gettysburg that the 1st Minnesota put its mark on history. On July 2nd, 1863, the second day of the three-day Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederate brigades were about to push through the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Now, the nature of battle of the day was two lines would line up against each other, and one would try to create an offensive to punch a hole in the other line, effectively breaching it and going through and enveloping the enemy forces and getting in behind them to surround them, get them to surrender. Well, this was about to happen. The Confederate brigades had punched a hole in the Union line on Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg, and they were about to run through it and probably win the battle. General Hancock, on his horse, frantically looked up and down the line for a way to plug that hole. And the nearest reinforcements that he could see were 5 minutes away. 5 minutes wasn't enough. At that very moment, right behind Cemetery Ridge on the road, was arriving the 1st Minnesota Regiment after a long road march in the July heat, and they were wearing wool uniforms. General Hancock rode right up to Colonel Colville, the commander of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, and he asked him to take his troops and fill that gap on the Union line. Colonel Colville didn't hesitate. His answer was to the last man. And he ordered a double-time charge, literally running through that gap and into the face of the oncoming Confederate brigades. Really, with unbounded fury, they attacked them and threw the Confederate brigades, some of them, into such chaos that many of them turned and ran right into the fire of their own people. In the end, the line held. Minnesota, the 1st Minnesota had saved the Union line at Gettysburg with enough time, giving them enough time to get reinforcements. But it didn't come without a cost. Of the 262 people, the men of the 1st Minnesota who made that charge, only 47 reported for roll call that evening. It is the single largest loss of any unit in the history of the Civil War. Now, it is widely accepted by Civil War historians that Gettysburg was a turning point in the Civil War, with the victor likely going on to win the war. It is also widely accepted by Gettysburg historians that without the 1st Minnesota and what they did there, the Confederates would have won at Gettysburg. General Hancock later said, "No soldiers on any field in this or any other country have ever displayed grander heroism." Colonel Colville, or I should say later on in a tribute to Colonel Colville at a monument which is erected in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, President Calvin Coolidge, in the dedication of that monument, said that Colonel Colville and the 1st Minnesota are entitled to rank as the saviors of their country. Those are pretty strong words. Now, while this is historically important and this is militarily important, I think it speaks to something even greater, and that is the spirit of volunteerism and sacrifice that I think is unique to many Minnesotans, in fact, most Minnesotans. I think it's something we hold in our hearts in this state that we can all be proud of. As the 19th century came to a close, the militias continued to fight along with the active duty forces, including the Battle of San Juan and Santiago, Cuba, during the Spanish and American War, under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, a guardsman, a militiaman. By 1900, there were 45 states in the U.S., each with their own militia. That means they had 45 different kinds of equipment, 45 different uniforms, 45 different styles of training. Since the Revolutionary War, these militias would volunteer to fight in the wars, but you can imagine with different uniforms, different equipment and training, they were not as effective as they could be if all were equipped and trained the same. Therefore, in 1903, the U.S. Congress, led by Congressman Charles Dick of Ohio, passed the Dick Act, named for its author, also known as the Militia Act. The Act, along with subsequent amendments, identified ways to fund, equip, and train the militias, helping them to become uniform across the nation. The Act also identified officially for the first time the term National Guard for these units. National Guard units were required by the Act to have 48 training periods each year and 15 days of annual training, which we also called camp. While they served as state militias throughout the year, they could be activated as a reserve of the Army by the federal government in times of national crisis and war. The militias, now called the National Guard, also fought in World War I. Here, the Men of Iron, as they were known, of the Pennsylvania National Guard, fought valiantly in France. After World War I, in 1920, at a St. Paul restaurant, a young Minnesota man named Ray Miller, who had served as a pilot in World War I, along with 2 other men, came up with the idea of starting a flying unit in the Minnesota National Guard. With the permission of the Adjutant General of Minnesota, they rented a Curtiss Oriole biplane, and Captain Ray Miller flew it to Washington, D.C. The trip took 8 days. His intent was to make a formal proposal to the National Guard Bureau to officially establish a flying unit in Minnesota. Captain Miller spent 3 days in Washington, D.C., making several official visits. And 3 months later, in January 1921, they were rewarded with a letter which established them as the first federally recognized National Guard flying unit in the country, marking the birth of the Air National Guard, of which I am a member, and John Giese is a member. Well, the Army and Air National Guard, now equipped and trained like their active duty counterparts, served in battles throughout Europe and the Pacific in World War II and later in Korea, Vietnam, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the Balkans, and virtually every conflict in the history of our country. Today, the Army National Guard deploys and fights seamlessly alongside of the active duty Army, while the Air National Guard deploys and fights in the skies along with the active Air Force. Since we are equipped and trained the same and wear the same uniform, we are virtually indistinguishable on the field of battle while deployed. So what makes us different? Well, there's several things. First, we are still the state militia when we are not activated to serve in our country's wars. The Minnesota National Guard belongs to the state of Minnesota. Today, our Commander-in-Chief, my Commander-in-Chief, is the Governor of Minnesota, not the President of the United States. All National Guard members, upon joining, will take 2 oaths, one to their state and one to their nation. This dual oath is not taken by members of the active duty who only take 1 oath to the United States. A second difference is that we respond uniquely to homeland emergencies. We call it domestic operations, and floods are probably the most common in Minnesota. But we also respond to severe weather emergencies, fires, and even riots. We are prepared to respond to domestic terrorism and even nuclear plant emergencies, all when called upon by the Governor of Minnesota. We have even dropped bales of hay from aircraft to cattle stranded by winter snows. Now, you heard me mention riots. Another unique characteristic of the National Guard is that we may conduct police functions, such as riot control or property protection, by prevention of looting after a natural disaster. The Posse Comitatus Act, which was established in 1878 and later amended in 1981, prohibits the use of federal forces to enforce state laws. The National Guard is exempt from this act because we are not federal forces. We are state forces, unless we are activated in a time of a national crisis. So to use federal forces in a policing action, that would be called martial law. And I can guarantee you, if we ever see martial law, we're in a world of hurt. Today, your Minnesota National Guard is composed of over 13,000 citizen soldiers and airmen. We serve as our state militia, but also as a reserve to the United States Army and United States Air Force, led by Major General Rick Nash, the Adjutant General of Minnesota, and our Commander-in-Chief, Governor Mark Dayton. We have 3 major military units within the state. In the Army National Guard, the 34th Infantry Division, also known as the Red Bulls, are headquartered in Rosemount, Minnesota, and commanded by Brigadier General Neil Lloydolt. They have approximately 11,000 soldiers serving throughout the state with armories in 63 communities throughout the state. And you can see by the locations of the stars on there where those armories are located. Now, while the Red Bull Division is highly capable and versatile, probably the prime unit of the Red Bulls is the 1st Armored Brigade Combat Team. You can see some of their equipment here, M1 tanks, the Black Hawk helicopters. The 34th Infantry Division heralds back to the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg and has seen key battles in World War II, multiple recent deployments, and holds the distinction, dubious as it is, of the single longest deployed unit since World War II, serving 22 months in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The Air National Guard in Minnesota has 2 units. The 133rd Airlift Wing, headquartered at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, is commanded by Colonel Jim Johnson. At the 133rd, the 109th Airlift Squadron flies C-130 cargo aircraft and is a direct descendant of the 109th Observation Squadron, started by Captain Ray Miller with federal recognition back in 1921. Headquartered in Duluth is the 148th Fighter Wing, commanded by Colonel Frank Stokes. The 148th flies F-16 fighter aircraft, which includes an alert mission to patrol the borders of the U.S. as they have done since the 1950s. The 148th was in the air within minutes after 9/11. Now, those of you who remember 9/11, which, judging by most of the audience in here, you do, you remember the moments after that when all aircraft in the United States were grounded. Commercial, private, it didn't matter. They were all grounded. Well, there were some aircraft up flying. It was the 148th Fighter Wing was flying combat air patrol over the Twin Cities to make sure nobody tried to do it again, what had happened in the Twin Towers. They did that for weeks and months after that. Never saw them. They stay pretty high, but they can see, and there's a little story about an aircraft shortly after 9/11. I believe it was in the Northeast metro area. A seaplane owner really needed to get his aircraft from one lake. Now, this is Minnesota. We got a lot of seaplanes and stuff like that in Minnesota. Wanted to get his aircraft from one lake to another one not very far away. And he thought, well, if I just get above the treetops, take off, get above the treetops, land on this other lake, I'll be good to go. He took off, and of course, after absolute silence for several days in the skies, people not hearing an aircraft, the sound of an airplane engine as he ran it up on that lake drew a lot of attention. People out on their docks shouting and yelling at him. And he took off, and he barely got off the water, and he had an F-16 fighter on each wing, giving him a pretty clear message that he needed to land that plane and in a hurry. And you can bet that he needed a change of underwear when that was over. The 148th Fighter Wing also flew combat air patrol over Washington, D.C., took their turn rotating out there, and here you have a photo of them flying over the United States Pentagon not long after 9/11. So nationally, the Army and Air National Guard serve in 54 states and territories with over 350,000 soldiers and over 106,000 airmen. Now, I mentioned 54 states and territories. Everybody knows 50 states. We also have National Guard units in District of Columbia. We have National Guard unit in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Guam, and in Puerto Rico. All of them have their own adjutant general that they answer to. So in summary, The National Guard started as the Militia and the Minutemen, formed in 1636, over 377 years ago. It is a state-based militia. It is composed of Army and Air personnel. There is no Navy or Marine National Guard. We take 2 oaths, one to our state and to our nation. That's unique. The active duty only takes 1 to the nation. We answer to the governor. He is our commander-in-chief, and the adjutant general is a member of his cabinet. Posse Comitatus law allows us to perform policing and law enforcement functions in our state. We will take on something like that. Everybody heard the big news yesterday about the Minnesota getting the Super Bowl for 2018. The National Guard will be involved in providing security for that event, just like we were for the Republican National Convention and every other major event that takes place here in Minnesota. The governor will call up the National Guard for assistance. 48 training periods are required of us each year, plus 15 days of annual training, or what we call camp. And we are present in 54 states and territories. And we do activate to help the federal government, the active duty Army and the active duty Air Force in times of national crisis and war. And here you have 3 Minutemen, myself on the right, the statue you are all now familiar with, and that's Captain Christina Hubert Gertz, my daughter, who is a member of the Minnesota National Guard as well. I thank you for your attendance and your interest, and I will be happy to entertain any questions if anybody has any.
Anyone with a quick question? I think we have time for one before we get to the next part of our program.
What was that word after posse or posse?
Posse Comitatus.
Yeah, what does that word mean after that?
It's Latin. It means, you know, I knew this once. I'm sorry, I do not know the answer to that.
Never saw it before.
Yeah, it's actually a federal law. It's the name of it. It's Latin, and posse means law. I can't remember what comitatus means. Common law. I believe it means common law. So.
Colonel, thank you very much for your time and obviously the research that went on. Let's give him another hand. At this point, as we move ahead, Colonel, I'll ask you to just leave your microphone here if you could so we can exchange technology, and I'll have Larry come up and Elaine come up if you would. We're going to have you come up right here and get microphones if you would so we can hear you for those that will be watching via videotape. Let you each put one of those on. It sounds like Larry has some surprises for us back there in his bag that was very heavy to pull up here. Let me introduce the two that will be telling us a little bit more about this evening tonight. Since the late 1970s, Elaine and Larry have taught many young and old to use story and storytelling in their work as parents, grandparents, educators, and activists. In 1980, they originated storytelling as a modern communication art at Metro State University, teaching it for over 10 years. In 1990, they organized the National Storytelling Conference on Storytelling and the Electronic Media. So they obviously have quite a bit of background in this. A little about the two. Larry has been telling stories since the 1960s as a camp director, Army medic, originator of participatory children's hospital TV and public schools storytelling video specialist. Elaine has performed and taught in Minnesota and around the world since 1976, focusing primarily on the healing art of storytelling. Please join me in welcoming Larry Johnson and Elaine Wynne.
How do you know all this stuff? And we live in the valley. And when John called and asked if we would do this, I thought we should be first because the main speaker is, you don't argue with Master Sergeant Giese, so here we are. In 1961, when I was 15, I took JFK's 50-mile hike. Anybody else do that? And years later, when I found out, I mean, it was just a sports challenge for me, but when I found out years later it was a qualification test for being in the Marines, and you know how fast I did it versus how fast you had to do it to be. I would, if I can say this way, apparently I would have been a hell of a Marine. But, that's another story. I got these really great hiking boots as part of I won an all-expenses paid trip to be a medic in faraway, exciting places during Vietnam. And when I got back, I mean, I'm glad for what the senator said, but when I got back, just like too often today, I finally wore them out, walking all over, trying to get a job. And I hope we can figure that out. But I was taught not to waste stuff, and so I didn't want to just throw it away when it was not good for walking anymore, so I turned it into a tap shoe. And actually, it's kind of disgusting that I should even have to think about this, but now we're having trouble sometimes coming up with the resources just for Veterans Memorial, for funerals. I hope we can straighten stuff like that out. I hope we can. Well, you know, it would make sense. 50-mile hike, 1961. When I turned 61, and that wasn't yesterday, it was logical to me to take a 61-mile hike on my 61st birthday. And the great thing was my 15-year-old grandson elected to go with. And so, and what we were trying to do was raise awareness and some money for, and I'm going to say this here, for ending wars that have more to do with profit for some weapons makers than legitimate defense, like the Colonel was talking about here, and to raise support for veterans who too often in our history have come out on the short end of, you know, even when stuff is made that even the generals don't want. So we left at 6:10 in the morning on my birthday and walked up Highway 61, and at Chisago City, we veered off on Highway 8 because my grandfather and my uncle are both veterans buried in Lindstrom. And we had at Chisago City, John Giese and then City Council person Mike Freiberg and the Lindstrom VFW met us there and walked into Lindstrom, and we had a 6:10 ceremony at the Lindstrom Veterans Memorial. That was the first day. We did 2 days this time because it was farther than 50 miles and I was older. And this is the spot where when I was a little kid, maybe about 8 years old, my brother and I were with my grandfather at that spot in Lindstrom, and we were helping him do the flag raising. And he was showing us all this stuff about how you fold the flag and why we respect it. And right in the middle of this thing, he just kind of broke. I mean, this was my fun grandfather, and I'd never seen him like this before. He just broke, and he said, "Boys, war is a horrible thing. I was in World War I, and my brother died there, and I hope neither one of you ever have to participate." And I don't know what you call that, but I call that not being afraid to tell the truth. He told us about the armistice that ended World War I. And this last year, I mean, the heavy stuff here, I was part of a state arts board grant that allowed veterans to make their own bell. In the spirit of the armistice of 1918, ending World War I. And I would not normally be interested in something like this, but because of what it was about, I made my own bell. And ring it 11 times, the way people did when that war ended, when they said, and actually the president that the colonel put up there, it's colonel, right? Put up there, Calvin Coolidge in 1929 made a speech on Memorial Day, and he said, we're gathered to honor those who have given their lives for the country, and there's no greater tribute we could pay to them than to do everything we can to not send them off unless absolutely necessary, to do everything we can to not let a war like that happen again. There were some nicer looking bells, veterans who were artists from the start, but mine had a better sound. There's a whole science to that. A couple more quick stories, and then Elaine's got, not far from Golden Valley, over on 4600 Park, or Columbus Avenue. There's now a plaque in front of the house. You can go look at it, 4600 Columbus Avenue. And it's a story that we learned a few years ago. We went to the dedication. In 1931, a World War I veteran, Arthur Lee, bought a house on the corner of 4600 Columbus. And he had come back and had done fairly well as a postal worker. But the problem was, the minute he bought the house, the whole neighborhood was up in arms. They surrounded the house. They were threatening the Lee family. They wanted him to move out. The problem was that Arthur and Edith Lee happened to be African American, and there was this kind of imaginary line that if your skin wasn't white, you didn't go past 42nd Street. And there was all kinds of trouble going on, people threatening, and Lee refused to move. And part of the thing that helped them was his fellow World War I vets, many of them members of the American Legion in that area, and the Postal Workers Union came and surrounded the house and tried to keep people away. And the plaque that's outside says, the most famous quote that Lee said during that time, when I was fighting in the mud and trenches in World War I, nobody asked me to move then. Why are they asking me to move now? Last story, I come to City Hall once in a while, and I was here a few years ago, just here asking the city council, I said, it's a free country. If people want to put that stuff on their lawn where they put the sign up that says, don't let the kids and the pets walk on it for 3 days, I guess they should be able to do that, but it shouldn't be okay for it to come over onto my lawn. It makes me sick. Physically sick, and I don't really think it does anybody any good, and there ought to be a way to stop that. This wasn't in my notes, but all of a sudden it just spilled out, and besides, most of that stuff is made by the same companies that gave us Agent Orange during Vietnam, and I don't believe in supporting companies that don't support the troops. And there was a row of stunned faces, and then somebody said, you're right. I just never thought of it that way before. And that's what stories are about, is to help us think of things differently. And I hope, I have several friends who are dealing overtly with the aftermath of Agent Orange 50 years later, and I hope we can straighten out a whole bunch of these things the way the senator talked about how we take care of veterans after we send them out. And now, here's Elaine.
Thank you.
I'm going first. Well, I grew up in Bemidji, Minnesota, that northern part of the National Garden of the state, and I now am the site coordinator for a community-based project for veterans. It's called the Veteran Resilience Project, and it has a kind of work with EMDR that helps with trauma. We're part of the community-based response network in Minnesota to people coming back and needing a little extra. If anybody has a loved one or anyone you think might be interested to know more about it, I'll give you things afterwards too. But I wanted to tell you a little about Bemidji High School because when I went to high school there, a lot of our teachers they'd gotten the GI Bill and they'd gone back to school and they were our teachers. Well, when I was in between my sophomore and junior year, had a hard time. My father died that summer, and my mother had a pretty hard time going on a lot of times for the next couple of years. Well, I want to tell you about 3 teachers who were there, who were really there for me. And, you know, we didn't so much know if some of the women were soldiers or veterans at that time. There probably were some, but they didn't talk about it. We knew these 3 guys were vets. And in my junior year in American history, we were discussing a lot about the Second World War, and Mr. Dahl was one of my favorite teachers because he was really good at getting a discussion going. And it didn't matter if people didn't agree with each other. He just wanted to see us do our learning through listening to each other and being able to express ourselves. So Mr. Dahl and I did not agree about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Dahl served in the South Pacific, and we had these disagreements. But he never turned the dial down on the conversation. He was always just revving us up to talk about things and trying to get us to talk about the facts in ways that were a little deeper and a little wider. Then it came time for the test. It was a long test, and then at the end was an essay. And the question was, should the United States have dropped the bomb in Hiroshima? And so I wrote out my essay telling what I thought and waited to see, because I knew he didn't agree with me. What was he going to do with it? Back came the paper, and he said, I don't agree with anything that you said, Elaine, but that was an excellent paper, and because you did so well on it, I'm going to give you an A+. I have to say, I think that was, he should have been teacher of the year. Well, the next year was my senior year in high school, and Mr. Skinner was my teacher. Now, people, you know, you call the people Mr. or Miss or Mrs. when you talked about them, but we did know that his name was Dick. And there were kids in school who were very inappropriate in making remarks. He had a condition that when he was speaking, he'd scratch himself a lot. And we didn't know what it was, but some of the kids would call him Itchy Dick. You know, it was just, he looked a little different from some people. One day, a couple of friends and I found out why he had that itch. And the person who told us said, well, he was in the Bataan Death March. And we didn't know what that was, but we found out that was a really dangerous and serious battle return of a number of soldiers during the Second World War, and he got malaria. And the scratching was the result of the symptoms of malaria. And he blew it off. He didn't respond to it at all. He just went on with his days and went on teaching us and challenging us. One of the things he did that year, he felt that I had been passed over for girls' state and that I should have been the one to go. So there came another chance, and it was the Star Tribune had a World Affairs seminar. So he nominated another girl student and I to go to that World Fair seminar. Oh, what a big deal. That was my first trip to the cities. And that's what we called them up in northern Minnesota. We stayed at the Fair Oaks Motel right near the Art Institute. Those big rolling hills out there in the front. And there were a whole lot of diplomats and foreign service people who stayed in one wing of the motel, and then all of us students in the other side with our chaperones. So it came up one day, we were discussing foreign aid, and we were talking about India. Isn't this strange after all these years? I just remember it like it was yesterday. And we were talking about how Russia was building hospitals in India. And what did we think about that? Did we think that was a good idea? And I said, I thought that was a very good idea, because if people saw that we cared about other parts of their lives, that they'd respond better to us. Well, this smart guy from Richfield stood up and said that was the silliest thing he'd ever heard. I'm paraphrasing. And he certainly did not agree with that. He gave his reason for it. And I said, well, you just never know what happens when you make a friend, or something like that. But I didn't back down with him. And there was Mr. Skinner standing in the lobby when I came out, and he shook my hand and said, I was so proud of you. You didn't let yourself be pushed around when somebody didn't agree with you. You stood up for what you thought. And it was a wonderful trip. We got to ride, we rode back and forth to Bemidji, and he had lots of stories about his kids and his wife. She was a home ec teacher for us in the school. And we really, if anybody ever said itchy dick again after that, we had a lot of things to say to him about what they were saying and doing. Well, then there was Mr. Drummond. Mr. Drummond ended up, he was the CEO of the National Guard in Bemidji, and he was my English teacher the senior year. Well, Mr. Drummond was another one of these guys who'd get these conversations going. He really wanted to draw us out, and we'd discuss literature, but then it would veer over into, his kids and child rearing. I think we all learned a lot about child rearing from Mr. Drummond. He'd tell us these catastrophic things that those little boys would do and how he dealt with it, and he'd make light of it and kind of make jokes with us about it. And other things would happen. We'd talk about funny things of what happened around the school, but then we'd get serious. We'd have to talk about literature or do something with diagramming sentences or something like that. Well, Mr. Drummond, one day I saw him in the hallway. There was a boy in our class who always broke the rules. He wore Levi's down, way down on his hips. You were not allowed to do that. And he'd have his shirt open all the way to the waist, and he had his hair all slicked back. We called those DAs in the old days, but he wore that hairstyle. And I don't know what had happened that morning. I think he was fighting with somebody in the hallway. And here I came. Mr. Drummond had him pinned up against the locker. You can't do that now. I have to tell you, it didn't look like a mean pin, and it didn't look harsh. But Wayne knew he meant business. And they were talking, what are you doing fighting out here? What do you think you're doing? And finally it ended up with, now you get on to your class right away. And what we found out 10 years after we graduated, Wayne came back. When he was going to school with us, we didn't know, most of us did not know, that his parents had been killed in a car accident when he was a sophomore. And I'm sure Mr. Drummond knew that, because he made it his business to know that kind of thing about the kids. He knew a lot about us. So here comes Wayne to the class reunion. Really sharp-looking, dressy, casual clothes. He was an English teacher. we just, we love that story. But after, Mr. Drummond got me to be the speaker for the National Honor Society to talk about scholarship. I can still recite it to you because he'd ask me all the time, well, how's it going? Are you getting ready for that? You know, it was kind of a dad thing he was doing. You know, he was kind of pushing me to try some new things. And I had to walk home partway from school. I'd be practicing that thing till it was just ground into my cells, I think, you know. That's what he was doing. He wanted that to happen, and it went off beautifully. But then he encouraged me to try out for the baccalaureate address. I didn't make it. In fact, I went up there and I totally froze. It was one of the worst experiences I'd ever had with speaking in front of people. But hey, he was right there now. Listen, it wasn't so bad. You know, it's all right. It's okay. You can try another time, you know. Didn't let me fall off feeling sorry for myself at all. Well, that summer, I had moved into the city and was working as a legal secretary for the county attorney. And one of my friends who worked there, well, she had graduated 2 years before, destined to start college in Bemidji, and she didn't. She stayed on there. Well, here came Mr. Drummond down the street one day. I was going out for lunch, and he said, "You got that application in? You got the application over there at that college?" And I said, "Well, no, I haven't put it in yet, but I'm going to." He said, "Yes, you are going to." And we talked a little more, and he said, "Now you listen here. If you don't have that in the next time I see you, I'm going to walk over there with you, and we're going to put that application in." And I thought it was kind of like the Wynne treatment without the, you know, the hand on the chest and pushing you up against the wall or something. But he was that push of a guy that just made people better. And I have to say, this all came back to me about a year ago when we were meeting with a group of OIF and OEF veterans. And everybody is always talking about how this vet did this and did that. You know, what I see is a group of people who are so willing to make sacrifices for other people and care about other people. And I see the attitude of one for all instead of all for me, which is sometimes what happens in our world today. And then I told them kind of the little outlines of a couple of these stories. And it was kind of quiet in there, but I really hadn't thought of these stories until I heard theirs. And I'm grateful all my life. When we get together for class reunions, we talk about those teachers still today. Thank you.
Elaine, Larry, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your stories with us. As we get ready to close the program, I believe we have a few presentations that are going to be made. The man will enter from behind the curtain shortly with some information for you. Again, thank you all for coming. This program has been taped tonight by Channel 12 and by the City of Golden Valley, so there'll be an opportunity for people to see this again. Now the presentations.
Thank you. Appreciate everyone for coming here tonight. I'm Master Sergeant John Giese, Minnesota Air National Guard. You know, Memorial Day is a special meaning for me, a Rocky vet. Served as a truck driver with the Army Reserve in 2005. Was brought up to respect Memorial Day by my World War II father. So I appreciate everyone who came here tonight, everyone watching home on TV. I have a few plaques that I'd like to present. Colonel Hubert, you would come forward, please. To Colonel Loren Hubert, for your dedication in preserving the history of the Militia and the National Guard. Your service in the United States Air Force is very much appreciated, and you profoundly exemplify service above self. An appreciation from all the veterans within the city of Golden Valley. Sir, Thank you. To Elaine and Larry, if you would come forward, please. To Elaine Wynne and Larry Johnson, for your never-ending dedication in supporting military members, past and present, promotion of peaceful dialogue, and desire in preserving history via the art of storytelling. Again, appreciation from veterans within the city of Golden Valley. Thank you. You got it. And for every good colonel has a good partner. And I would ask that Teresa Hubert please come forward. We have something for you. I left it in the box because it's easy to transport, and the Huberts are awaiting their fourth grandchild. She's in labor as we speak, so here are some beautiful flowers. But thank you for supporting your husband for 22 years. And a lot of times the service members get all the glory and all the praise, but it's really the wives, the husbands, the children, all that put up with a lot with them missing and what. So we want to honor you tonight, too. Thank you. And now I call on fellow Golden Valley resident Mike Herdlicka. He has a presentation that he does. It's all expenses paid by him. This man has given out nearly almost 2,000 Patriot pens. And this is a service that he does. And we'd like to give him the mic real quick before we end our service.
If I could have two people come forward, please. Colonel Hubert, if you could come up, please. And Mr. Johnson, Larry, if you could come forward, please. Please come up, sir. Major Suarez. Gentlemen, we're here tonight to honor your service and sacrifice to the United States of America. Your fellow veterans, excuse me, your fellow veterans and armed service members at the time, right now, and fellow citizens want to thank you because we realize that you have written a check at one time in your life for everything you possessed, up to and including your lives. That is duty, honor, sacrifice, and God knows we don't have enough of that today. For your love of country, we would like to present you with a small token of appreciation. This is the Patriot pen, number 1,139, probably out of order today, 1,144, and 1,145. Please open them, gentlemen. You join a group, including General Petraeus, that proudly display their Patriot pens today. It's from the American Legion Chesterford, 523, and from Veterans in the Valley. Gentlemen, thank you, and thank you for your love of country. Major, thank you.
And I'd just like to thank Dave Kaiser for hosting this event tonight. He volunteered to do this. And for our great city manager, Tom Burt, who volunteered his time tonight to keep this open. Also want to recognize one city council member, Joni Clausen, who is present here tonight. And for the Golden Valley Historical Society, Don Anderson is also present here tonight.
You just want to remind viewers and all those present here tonight, take some time on Memorial Day to honor the fallen and the 83,282 current POW MIAs still unaccounted for since World War II. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Reflections on Memorial Day. Have a great evening.